In this session, we're going to talk about, well, what's next after determining that loss of control in flight is the #1 threat to air safety, and the suspicion is the training system is letting us down. Well, we need to start into the safety risk management process, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But remember, as a pilot, are you prepared to deal with an unexpected airplane upset event on its way to a fatal loss of control in flight accident? That's always the underlying question, so let's jump right in. Okay, in our previous video, we landed here on this slide. We're going to go ahead and link it right up here and down in the description below. We ended up arriving at looking at the fatal loss of control in flight statistics and seeing what a paradigm shift would have to look like. How do we drive down those fatalities? But the biggest thing, that big red circle there identified that it's the training system's deficient use of effective academics, on-aircraft training, and advanced simulation to mitigate this risk that results in every pilot not being in control. So loss of control in flight is without question the #1 threat to safety, the #1 killer. So to analyze this, what we need to do is we have to have a look at the safety risk management process, because understandably, you may feel like loss of control in flight is just far too late in the process, and you're right. It's the ultimate outcome or consequence or risk. It's the final state of this fatal condition. We need to take action before that, preferably way prior to that. So let's go ahead and jump in here. So when you're out in the industry, or even perhaps yourself, is very often, this is called the yeah, sure, but discussion. Now, the villain, interestingly enough, as I mentioned in one of the opening videos, is the training system itself. And the reason why it's the worst villain of all is because it doesn't know that it's the villain. In fact, I would submit to you that every instructor, every training center, every regulator out there is doing their absolute very best to give you the best training system in the world. So what ends up happening is the villain, not knowing it's a villain, is whispering a few things in your ear. For example, loss of control is not really the issue. What it really is distraction. It's automation mismanagement. It's complacency. It's flight control failures. And yes, while all those are hazards associated with the risk or ultimate consequence of loss of control in flight, there's more than that. In fact, there's 20 more than that, which hazards have an associated outcome of loss of control in flight. So to understand this, to understand the relationship between hazards, which people often say, oh, it's just that, and very often they'll cite a hazard, let's just deal with that, we'll take care of it. The problem is that there's not just one, there's over 20 as I talked about. So to understand this timeline, which goes from the hazard, the originating point of the risk, through time that results in the fatal loss of control in flight accident, we have to introduce some concepts. And I'm going to use ICAO Doc 9859, the safety management manual, to use standardized concepts to help you understand this process. Because we have to understand this to understand what the mitigation is, what the industry is doing, and what's missing, and what additional action we need to take. Because if you're like most pilots, you are doing everything right. You're staying current, you're getting your medical, you're doing your type rating, you're doing additional training to be the best pilot that you can be. But this massive gap is still there in your skills. Fatal gaps, in fact, that make you susceptible to loss of control in flight unnecessarily. Okay, so let's jump in. So the key concepts: hazards on the left, the originating situation we're going to define in a minute, leading over time to an accident, and in this case is loss of control in flight, which is the ultimate consequence, outcome, or risk. So what I'd like you to do, if you'd like to learn more, and you don't have to, by the way, I'm going to use these terminologies that you can look up in this resource. In Safety Risk Management Decision Aid, which is figure 2.6 in ICAO Doc 9859 Safety Management Manual, specifically Chapter 2, you're going to see this decision aid. And you're certainly welcome to go through it. It's very intuitive, very obvious. It's an excellent resource for you. What I want to do is I just want to step back and have a conversation about this. You can go and validate and verify what I'm saying in that resource, but I want you to have the big picture and understand before you dive into the manual. Okay, so let's talk about some definitions that are in there. So the first thing, that thing on the left at the top, the hazard, what is that? Well, a hazard is an undesirable condition, like I mentioned earlier, or situation which may lead to unsafe events or occurrences. Okay, unsafe events or occurrences, okay? It could be one event, could be multiple events, or occurrence, and typically the occurrence is a accident of some kind, okay? So the thing to note here, because terminology sometimes is the enemy of understanding, is that sometimes the term threat, for example, in threat and error management, is used instead of hazard. So keep that in mind as we go through this process, all right? It's not uncommon to get into a debate of which term applies here and which doesn't, but it's the overall principle that the risk is the outcome or ultimate consequence, loss of control in flight, but the hazards are the source of that escalating risk. The second one here is the unsafe event, and this is really important to the work we're talking about here today. Let's read that definition, because it's pointing, as you can see, to the airplane upset, and underneath it says in control. Now that's important. It's one of the latest stages where the pilot is still able to influence the outcome of that event. So the definition is this: an unsafe event is a possible intermediate unsafe event before any ultimate consequence, accident, or most credible outcome. And an airplane upset is a great example of that. And the reason why that matters is no matter where the risk of loss of control in flight originated, distraction, cross-check, thunderstorm, whatever it might be, as it proceeds to the fatal loss of control in flight event, it has to go through the window of the airplane upset, which is why it's critical for pilots to have key parameters programmed in: pitch, high, low, bank, angle of attack, speed. This is an airplane upset. Whatever I was doing before doesn't matter. Let's focus on getting the airplane back into the heart of the envelope. So this is a really key part of mitigating loss of control in flight, because it's one of the last opportunities where the pilot is still in control to affect the outcome and avert the event. So let's go to the last one here, and a whole bunch of stuff just showed up on the screen. Let's go to ultimate consequence, because that is talking about loss of control in flight, okay? So loss of control in flight is the ultimate consequence, all right? So it's important for you to understand here that the most credible outcome, ultimate event or accident, loss of control in flight, is the ultimate consequence. Now notice in there, before we go to the bottom part of the red, there's two arrows coming off that now. The red one points to what shows up in the statistics, but the yellow one, the other one coming off ultimate consequence, is pointing at not in control. And this is really, really key, and it really brings into attention why the airplane upset is critical to you as a pilot. You can take action on this right now by simply defining your parameters that you will not worry about whatever you're doing before, but take control of the airplane and get it back to where you need it to be. Because there's always a point before a fatal loss of control in flight accident where the pilot can no longer influence the final ultimate outcome, the fatal accident. It could be due to time available, altitude available, lack of skills. It could be aerodynamics are prohibiting recovery. The point is, before the fatal impact, there's a point at which there's no way to avoid it. And we want to take action way earlier than that. Very often pilots go way beyond a reasonable definition of an airplane upset to the point where they can't control the airplane anymore, okay? So let's look at the definition at the bottom of loss of control in this context, okay? Loss of control in flight represents the ultimate consequence, accident state, outcome, or risk resulting when hazard mitigation and recovery defenses fail, okay? So hazard mitigation are all the things that we learn to do in aviation, from aeronautical decision making, flight path management, threat and error management, undesired aircraft state management, even stalled on unusual attitude training, and some measure of upset prevention recovery training is there. That's a whole other topic. But the point is, it's when they fail, that's how that outcome occurs. And that's what we're talking about here today, okay? So the last thing I want to bring to your attention, I just cleared up the slide a little bit, is it's important to realize that those key concepts of hazard, airplane upset, where the pilot is still in control, before the situation of not being in control, which is before the fatal loss of control in flight accident, it's important for you to realize that this doesn't show up without notice. And in fact, as we look at the safety risk management process, we can see that hazard identification is the first thing to do. And we're going to do that in another video. Let's put our finger on what those hazards are. Then we need to do a safety risk assessment. Is this an intolerable risk, a tolerable risk, or is this an acceptable risk, to determine whether we need to mitigate it or not. And I'll submit to you right now, the number one threat to air safety needs mitigated to be really squelched down to an acceptable level. And then we apply safety risk mitigation, all right? And in this particular series, it's largely upset prevention and recovery training. But at the end of it, we have to assess the ultimate risk. Is it acceptable or not? Are we going to proceed with the operation or cease the operation? So if you look at the top of the diagram right now, we have the key concepts, but I want to remind you that when those hazards show up, whatever they might be, remember hazard identification is the first concept. If we can identify a hazard and eliminate the hazard, that eliminates the associated risk. The problem with loss of control in flight is there's 20 of them, and not all of them, in fact, very few of them can be eliminated from your exposure in your flight operations. But as that associated risk with the hazard, whatever it might be, proceeds from left to right, the good news is, as you can see in those vertical dotted lines, the industry has put in place many mitigations. Unfortunately, the training system itself perpetuates loss of control in flight as the #1 threat to air safety. And in this video series, we're going to talk about the process of understanding that. Watch this video again if you need to. It's important to understand this terminology moving forward. And now, what can we do to take effective action? So I'm excited about this. This is going to be a whole lot of fun because as we go through this process together, this is all going to make sense. And in fact, what's going to happen from time to time, I'm going to say, if you don't fully understand this, stop here, go back and watch that video, because I want you to get the most value out of every single video. Now, Einstein said you should always explain the thing as simple as possible, but no simpler. Now, the #1 threat to air safety is dominating aviation safety because it's a complex threat. And I'm going to do my very best to explain it in simple terms, but it's important for you to take the time to learn some of these concepts at the end of it so you can motivate yourself to take action, because it's completely unnecessary and you deserve better. I'll see you in the next video.